Content warning, this episode contains discussion of the sexual abuse of children, including child sexual abuse materials.
In this episode, we continue our conversation with Courtney Alwine, the Miami County Deputy Prosecutor who led the recently concluded case against Kegan Kline.
In the first part, we discussed how Courtney first got involved with the case, and we took the story up to the point where Kegan Kline decided to plead guilty to all charges. In the second part, we're going to pick up with the story from there and start with the sentencing hearing that wasn't, the day Kegan Kline was originally scheduled to be sentenced, and he declared that perhaps he didn't want to plead guilty after all.
In this episode, we discuss Courtney's feelings about the sentence, her thoughts on the potential second user of the Anthony Shots account, and how the delay of Kegan Kline's arrest may have actually helped strengthen the case against him.
My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
And this is The Murder Sheet.
We're a true crime podcast focused on original reporting, interviews, and deep dives into murder cases.
We're The Murder Sheet.
And this is The Delphi Murders, a conversation with Kegan Kline prosecutor Courtney Alwine, Part 2, after the guilty plea.
One other surprise that happened throughout all of this is, of course, the sentencing hearing that wasn't. That's what we call it. We all go in expecting there to be a sentencing, and then Kegan does something different. And I was just curious, what was your experience of that day and your reaction to that development?
That was not a fun day.
I imagine not.
Nope, that was not a fun day for us. So that day, I will say, the most nervous that I was the day of the change of plea hearing. The day of the sentencing hearing that wasn't. That one was the one that was in May. That one, I was nervous, but I was more antsy. I was just really geared up. I was so prepared and ready. I think I got to the courthouse at 6:30 that morning. I knew I wanted to get in before, all of the media showed up. I wanted to get in before our staff showed up. I wanted to get in before my witnesses showed up. I wanted to have, that time to just sit with my notes and go over everything just one last time. And that morning I got a call from someone with the sheriff's department saying, Kegan's wanting to withdraw his plea. I'm just letting you know, this is what's going on. So I found out that morning. I called Andrew and told him. And so he was still in his office. He was, I think, doing the same thing I was, having that last minute prep in the morning. He went, was talking to Kegan. And then there was a lot going on that day as far as, he was making some claims about not having received discovery. I think, Andrew's office is trying to figure out what happened. I don't know the exact details of that, of course. That was a really frustrating, long morning. There was a really long delay, and that was because, they're trying to figure all of these things out. We were up in the courtroom ready to roll. We were ready to go. And I think part of that, I could have waited in my office. I knew this was going on. I could have waited in the law library, but I was going to wait in that room with everyone else because I knew that what was going on, I felt was a delay tactic. I was frustrated. And so I was going to sit here and I was ready to roll. And I was going to object as hard as I could object to a continuance or to, withdrawing this because the judgment of conviction had already been entered. And it was just, it's like the rug had been pulled out from under our feet. And that kind of has been a weird theme for 2023. So I think at that point I was just like, again, really? Again, another time that I'm just going to like have everything ready to roll. And it's just going to be like, well, nope. And so that was really frustrating. Then for the added kind of component of him basically saying, you guys didn't give us this. And whether he was saying we didn't give it to them or his attorney didn't give it to him, that's the kind of stone you just don't throw. You're not going to accuse us of being unethical. We have the receipts, man. Like I have the letter and I had it that day. I have the letter to the defense attorney saying attached with this letter are the following records, including the ones that he was saying he'd never received. So that is also frustrating when the work that you're doing, when you've put so much work and you've tried so hard to make sure everything is above board, which is really important to us, then to be accused of behaving poorly when we weren't, that was infuriating. I was pretty angry that hearing. Yeah, I know it showed on the record, and that was me trying as hard as I could to reel it in, but that he was playing games. I think he saw the recommendation was 35 years. I think he saw on the news or something where, people were speculating, in theory, he could get all concurrent sentences and be out by this spring. And I think he heard that and ran with it from someone randomly saying that of, we don't know. It could all run concurrent. It could all run consecutive. And I think he probably heard that and was just like, well, I could get out in the spring. And then he gets a recommendation of 35 years. I think he just freaked out.
That makes sense. And it's interesting to kind of compare that to, the period of time where he could have potentially gotten a deal. And then it's like, there's still like efforts to gum up the works, even when that's off the table, that it just ends up prolonging everything.
Yeah, I think that was one of the more frustrating points too, is like, man, the finish line was right there. And now we're pushed 2.5 more months. Ugh. Yeah.
That was a crazy day.
That was a crazy day.
When you get down to it, would you have preferred a trial?
In some ways I would have. If I go back in time to when he pled guilty, it was a huge relief to say, well, at least now we don't have that to deal with. We can just focus on the sentencing. Doing the sentencing, it was such a complicated process. The sentencing was more difficult than the trial would have been. The trial is straightforward. Like, here's the facts. Here's the images. Here's the videos. Here's the story. It's very linear. It's very straightforward. It's not confusing. That a jury trial would have been so much easier than the sentencing hearing. If we had done a jury trial, then when we went to sentencing, Judge Spar would have already seen all of that evidence, heard all of that testimony. So then going to sentencing, we can say, well, Judge, you've seen the evidence. You've heard the testimony. We could have called Cecil and Vito and fleshed out some of the things that can't come in. Some of the stuff about how long this has been going on or the uncharged stuff to build it out a little more. But if we'd had a trial, Judge Spar would have had all of that information walking in. So in some ways, I kind of wish we had the trial. I kind of do. It took a lot of stress off of my shoulders to only have one big hearing rather than two. But I think I would have preferred in this case to have had the trial rather than just a guilty plea.
The sentencing hearing was very different from other sentencing hearings we've attended, because usually we just have the only witnesses would be people making victim impact statements. So I'm curious if you can discuss and share with us some of the strategical choices you made to proceed with this different type of sentencing hearing.
So because he pled guilty, because Judge Spar didn't have all that information, I needed to get it in front of him. And so this was a little different. You're right. Most sentencing hearings, you're not going to spend an entire day. You're going to have, witness statements. Maybe you'll call the probation officer to talk about the PSI and talk about some of those things to flush those details out. But you're not really going to do all of that. The deal with this one, we have a statute that tells us what the aggravating circumstances are, what the mitigating circumstances are. And then there's some other things where it's like, you can also have these things that aren't in these statutory aggravators or mitigators. But this is your guide. This statute tells you how to do this. When I was preparing that sentencing hearing and trying to make arguments for both the statutory and the non-statutory aggravators, in order to support that, I had to put those witnesses on. Because the PSI, even though there were 720 pages, the transcripts were attached. So that's a huge number of pages that are just transcripts of statements. It wasn't the entire case report. It wasn't Chris Cecil's entire forensic examination report. So if those were attached, Judge Spar would have had all of that to review ahead of time, and we could have referenced it as part of the sentencing. Since he didn't, we had to give him that, right? Like crafting a sentence, especially for a case that's so complex the way this is. It's like creating a sculpture. And so how do we expect him to create a sculpture if we're holding the hammer and the chisel in our hands and not giving them to him? How do we expect him to do what we're asking him to do if we don't give him that information? So in this case, we decided to do that by putting in Chris Cecil to testify about his report in full, about the data, what he found about the process. We decided to put up Dave Vito to talk about the investigation as a whole, because Judge Spar didn't know all of that. He didn't know really any of that. And so everything had a purpose. We were scheduled for a full day. That was at my request when we were trying to schedule and saying, like, how much time do you need? I asked for a full day. I did not think it was going to take the whole day. I thought we would be completely done by 2, but what it came down to and what I was asking for was, look, if we do half a day and we get there and we need more time, I don't want to bifurcate this hearing and have to come back and get back into it. Let's just have a full day. There's plenty of time. We can take as much time as we need. Lo and behold, we needed every minute of it. And then some, because we were there until 7:30, I think.
Yeah, something like that.
It was a really long day. There was a lot of information that we were putting out there. And I think, a lot of things people could say, well, why did you need to every single thing that we asked, every single thing that we were talking about had a specific strategic purpose. It was to support these aggravators so we could get the sentence that we were asking for. If we didn't call them, we weren't going to get the 35 that probation recommended, let alone the 43 that he ended up sentencing. So that was kind of the idea behind it. It was a very methodical and strategic process, which I don't know if it necessarily came off that way to watch it. I hope it didn't. I hope it seemed a little more organic than what it was, but it was incredibly strategic. Everything had a purpose.
I know we appreciated it from the perspective of the press because I felt like it was an opportunity to get more information. And, one thing about a trial is that that's an opportunity for a lot of things to come out about an investigation and now that fills in those details. But we were able to observe this through this kind of sentencing hearing.
And also, I think, as you mentioned, I think some people may have had the idea that the CSAM material was something like topless pictures of 15 or 16-year-old girls. And so from our perspective, I think it was very important to get the true facts out there.
Yeah, like hearing about the girl who took photos of herself in a hospital bathroom while her mom is sick. I mean, that is just so horrible. And like having that context, because I think some people, understandably, maybe they're not so familiar with the internet or how teens use the internet, but they might write this off as, okay, well, that's horrible that Kegan did that, but is that really that big of a deal? And this drove it home, like the impact on those people and that he did this too, and just the sheer scope of it.
Yeah. I think one of the things too, And, if you weren't in that room to hear that, or if you weren't following some of the people who were in the room, or you didn't know some of these factors, it wasn't even just that he was soliciting and holding on to these pictures. It wasn't just, we're talking about how manipulative he is, but talking about how graphic and manipulative he was. So victim one, who you're referring to, we call her victim one because she was the victim in count one of the charging information, the child solicitation. So, of course, we are going to protect our juvenile victims' identities. Victim one, that story is just awful and tragic. And, he is taking this girl who's going through a lot. Her mom's in the hospital. She's so sick that she's hospitalized. There's this relationship between them. And then he's basically soliciting these photos and videos of her, multiple, while she's in the hospital with her mom. And these are taken in the hospital bathroom, which you can tell from the photos that like these are not taken in a residential bathroom. It's really hard to think about that. And that's without having read the conversation between the two of them, where, he would say at one point, I think I talked about this at the sentencing hearing. At one point, they're texting back and forth, and she says to him, and of course she's texting Emily Ann, but this is Kegan. So she's texting him and makes a comment about, yeah, I'm waiting for my boyfriend to come pick me up. They're going to go hang out. And Kegan, as Emily Ann, very quickly is like, oh, well, it's probably a little hard to hear just factually speaking, but, Kegan would say things like, oh, well, I was just getting a hold of you because I was thinking about cutting myself. And I want this to end. And it's, she makes a comment about her boyfriend and they're going to go hang out. And then Kegan would just say all of these horrible things to like guilt her into paying attention to him and holding this grasp on her. The things that he was doing to these girls is just unbelievable. He sent her, as Emily Ann, CSAM video, and not just a video of, teens that were of the same age, but of 2 or 3 year old fondling an adult male penis. And I mean, it's just sickening, because to think about, when you see those images, when you see those videos, it affects you. I don't care who you are. It affects you. It changes you. And to think that he sent that video to a 13-year-old girl. Like, if this is changing me, I'm 34 years old. If this is having this kind of impact on me, an adult who is doing this work, what kind of impact did that have on this 13-year-old girl? I mean, that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about possession of topless pics. That's bad. We'd have fought that fight for those. But this is so much worse than that.
When you look back on the sentencing hearing, the one that actually did take place, what sort of memories come to mind for you as far as standing out from that day?
So I felt that day, I didn't feel nervous, which is weird. I expected to walk in and just feel very anxious. I had none of that. We went upstairs. Judge asked us to come back into chambers, and I was in the courtroom, and they called us into chambers, and he basically was just checking in with us. Are we ready to go? Is he going to withdraw? Is he going to do this? And all 4 of us, Eric Honeyegger, Bill Berkshire, Jennifer, and myself were in the room, and we said, nope, we're ready to roll. And so it was like, all right, let's go. And we walk out of the room and walk into the courtroom, and that moment, it was weird to know it's finally here. It's finally happening. This has been 3 years in the making, and we're here. To also know I have looked at these for years now. I will never forget this case. This case is just the bane of my existence. And Kegan Kline is the worst kind of human. And it's go time. To know, in preparing Kathy Knight, the probation officer, for trial or for the sentencing hearing, one of the things she talked about, I think she talked about this in her testimony as well, was that he views women as objects. He doesn't view women as humans. He views women and girls as objects. I'm 5'2". I am 5'2", and I have a pretty big personality. But I walked in, and he is sitting at the defense table by himself because all of the attorneys, we were all in the other room. And I walked in and I looked at him. I looked him in the eye for the first time ever. And he immediately looked away from me. And I felt, the only way I can describe it, I felt a wave of joy, just pure joy. And it was, we're here. We're going to do this thing. It's not getting continued. It's time. And it was, this predator has done so many things. He has treated so many girls so terribly. He has treated so many women terribly while he's been in jail. I mean, this is someone who does not respect women at all. And I get to stand up to this bully today. It was the weirdest thing. I don't know that I've ever felt anything like that. I mentioned my family was there. They were in the front row. I wanted there to be a barrier between me and the wall of media. When I turned around, after a witness, or turned around after an exhibit, or turned around during a break, I wanted to have familiar faces where I felt I could remain grounded and in that moment and not get distracted by everyone who's there to watch. I needed to be here. And so I texted my family before we started, and I just said, I just feel a wave of joy right now. That was a really weird moment. Once we got started, Jennifer and Chris Cecil did theirs first, and the whole time, I'm listening, taking notes, making sense, and I'm bouncing in my seat. I'm so ready to go. My family's laughing because they're like, "You are chomping at the bit. You are ready." And every time that we would have a break, every time there would be a recess, my mother was there, and my mom would just look at me and she'd say, "It's almost over." Every break, it's almost over. I was just exhausted. I mean, it was a 10-hour day, I think. It was exhausting. So those are some little moments that pop out. The argument was a solid hour. It felt like 15 minutes for me. I don't know. Maybe it felt like longer than an hour for you guys, but it just felt like it was so fast. And I cut out probably a third of what I was going to argue because I kept looking at the clock and I was like, "Oh, it's 4. Okay, cut that. I don't need it. Oh, it's 4:15. Move on." And so I'm cutting a lot of things, and still my argument was a solid hour. And just, I never ran out of stamina. The only pauses I took were to take a drink of water, I think. That it was very emotional. I was not expecting the argument and the immediate aftermath to be so emotional. There are moments in that argument where, you're feeling the disgust of what you're talking about. There are moments where you're feeling the anger of what he's done. And it's very, I don't know. I think I had the best day of work that I have ever had. I did my absolute best. There's not a single thing that I would change, and I'm grateful for that on a case like this. In theory, this could have been the biggest single day of my entire career, not up till this moment, but like my entire career ever. Just a weird thing to think about. But it was just smooth. I allowed myself to really be present and in that moment. And I had prepared for so long. I knew my arguments. I had my notes prepared where I could kick through them and not forget anything. But it felt very, very present. Those moments where reading the victim impact statements, I read those to Kegan Kline. I didn't read those to the court because those words were meant for him. And, what a powerful moment to do that. And, if, he can't look at me. It's terrible. The things that he has done are terrible. And he won't look at me. That's fine, because these things he is going to hear from me. He's not going to hear me saying them to the court. He's going to hear me say them to him, because no one has stood up to him this way. Just overwhelming. Like, the whole day was overwhelming, but that argument, I've been reliving it for 2 weeks now and just thinking about it. And eventually that'll stop. But it was just an overwhelming experience. And when it was done, the crash, I mean, this was almost like a jury trial. We kept feeling like, every time there's a break, we were waiting for judge to admonish the jury. When he said he needed time, that's like waiting for a verdict. So I was like, I'm going to my office. I don't want to be seen. I don't want to be on. I just want to go hide in my office until he's ready. And then when he read the sentence, that I was taking notes furiously of what was happening and just feeling more and more relief. And then immediately after, I was really emotional. I know I gave you guys a comment, and gosh, you can hear it in my voice so much, which I didn't realize at the time until after the fact, listening to it. It's like, gosh, you can just hear, talking to the news later, watching the news the next morning, I look at it and, my mom's like, you sound fine. Like, you're articulate, you're good. And I look at it and I'm like, I look shell shocked. I look like I've been through, I look like I'm just there. Like, to me, it doesn't look like me. It doesn't sound like me. Yeah, it was an unbelievable experience. I will never forget that day.
When you regrouped with Detective Vito, Jen, the rest of the Miami County Prosecutor's Office, like, how are you guys reacting immediately after the verdict comes down? Or not the verdict, the sentencing. Oh God, now I'm doing.
I know it felt that way though,
really
right?
did.
Like, it felt like a jury trial. It didn't feel like a sentencing.
Yeah.
So we all went down to our office, and it was just, I think we all just had this, it was equally light and also just so tired. And so, we didn't stick around for too terribly long because it had been a very long day. But, lots of handshakes and hugs and just talking about different things and different moments and different points. And I think, frankly, nobody thought we were going to get that sentence. I think everybody thought 20 was the max that we were going to get. And so Jen and I are looking at it. We're like, nope, there's more here. We can do more. We can do more. And everyone else is looking at this and saying, I don't think you're going to get that much. But they're looking at it, which I think a lot of people do, of saying, but he didn't actually molest a child. Like, yeah, but you got to look at the facts. We're not talking about 1 or 2 counts and saying, well, this should be, we're talking about 25 counts and some pretty egregious behavior. And the more that we were going, I think the people in the room were kind of putting together, they're gonna get this done. Yeah, it was, I think there was just a lot of pride in that room.
Yeah, it was interesting. At first, Kevin and I didn't really know, like, okay, with a case like this, what would be typical. But I think, especially when Kathy Knight came out and recommended 35, or what was it, 30 or 35?
I think 35.
35. We were like, oh my God, like that's from the probation office. And, I'm curious in terms of, were you mentioned kind of like not necessarily thinking you were going to get that much. Can you talk us through Judge Sparr's sort of reasoning and how you followed it and sort of what he looked into as he was deciding this? And I want to stress one thing that, we've said on the show, but like, this is not about Delphi. He's looking at the stuff in this case and just emphasizing that.
Yeah. So really, I mean, we didn't talk about Delphi at all. We had to touch on it in the small point of, our case stemmed from another investigation, but we were very, very careful about not speaking about it. Because, I mean, we're not just making this argument to Judge Spar, we're also making this to the Court of Appeals, because we know if he gets a sentence that's more than like 10 years, he's probably going to appeal it. And so you want to lay out a record where the Court of Appeals can look at this and say, nope, that is just, that is proper. In going through, it needed to be very methodical. And so ultimately, I think Judge Spar saw things the same way we did with a few different changes, and he was right. I think, I recommended 50 years and had a breakdown for that. His 43 was more proper than my 50. If the sentencing hearing was tomorrow, knowing that, I would still ask for the 50 because there was an argument for it. But what it comes down to, I think Judge Spar's sentence was definitely the right call in this case. So what I did in the sentencing hearing, in my argument, I went through the statute for aggravators and mitigators. And there were a handful that I had highlighted, like this fits, this fits, this fits. So there's one statutory aggravator that if the victim is under the age of 12, then that's an aggravating circumstance. So, here we had some of these videos where not only was the victim under 12, but significantly under 12. We're talking about toddlers. So that's a huge mitigator. When the threshold is 18 and we have a 2 or 3-year-old, that is a hugely different situation. I mean, we've been talking about, a topless selfie of a 14-year-old versus some of these videos. That's a huge difference in how bad it is and how traumatic it is just to see it. So, we're going through those very methodically and finding all of those aggravators. We have to have more aggravators than mitigators in order to stack the sentences. The other thing that we had to do is we had to figure out the episodes of criminal conduct, and that can be a little convoluted. The way we broke it down was, child solicitation, it's the only count with that victim. It's the only count of solicitation. That's an episode. And then you go through the exploitations, which is basically distribution of child pornography, or CCM. These should go together because they were all sent within one conversation on one day with one individual. And so we're breaking these up, and it is a very technical argument about what these episodes should be. So once you get those episodes figured out, then you have to say, well, do those episodes run concurrent or consecutive? And in order for them to run one after the other, you've got to have more aggravators than mitigators. So the whole point of the whole sentencing was to talk about those aggravators. Everything that came in evidence was to talk about those aggravators later. So we could say, not only are these the episodes, they should stack, and here's why. So when Judge was going through, he ultimately agreed with our analysis of the episodes of criminal conduct. There were 13 episodes, and he agreed with all 13 of those episodes. So that was a huge win for us to say, like, okay, we're analyzing this the same way. Where we differed, the only things, he ran a couple of the level 6 possessions. Those would be the possessions. Those would be the images of like the topless 14, 15-year-olds. He would run those concurrent with, if there was a level 5, a bad photo or video, he would run those in the same. So I think that's proper. I don't, in hindsight, I don't think there's really a basis for stacking some of those the way that there would be for some of the harsher videos. So really, it was very complicated, but it was very, very technical. And the way he went through it was basically a very similar way to how we did. Here's the episodes. Now here's all the aggravators. Here's a mitigator. You did save the time and expense of a trial. We'll give you that. But there's the aggravators, tip those scales way far in the other direction. So we were able to get that sentence.
We were curious. I know there's been some confusion on because of on the Indiana Department of Correction website, Kegan's getting out in the 2030s or something. I think that's actually been corrected
I believe
today.
that's been corrected today.
Today, yes.
Yeah. And I was just curious if you could speak to that. And, I know a lot of people have talked about good time and things like that.
Mhm.
But from your understanding, how long could he serve this?
So, yeah, I mean, it's a lot of data entry to get all that information in there. And you were at the sentencing hearing, there was a lot of this runs concurrent to this, but consecutive to this. That abstract of judgment is confusing. So I wasn't surprised when there were some errors at first. When you go to RDC, they're getting some things in, but then the abstract goes downstate and they really go through. So this is pretty common that in the first week or so, you may have some things that are off. If you give it a little bit of time, they're going to get all of that data entry in there. There's also 25 counts and sentences that they've got to put in. So that just takes time. He's not getting out in 2034. Yeah, that's not happening. So right now, the DOC website says his out date is August 19th of 2048. I ran the numbers myself. That may be right. The number I came up with was August 10th or 11th of 2049. So, I mean, that's only a year, right? So maybe they're right. Maybe I'm right. I don't know. I'm not great at math. So I will be the first one to say, take that with a grain of salt. So as of today, his out date would be in August of either 2048 or 2049, depending on which of us have the right numbers. That is basically related to the day-for-day credit or 75% credit time for whether you're Class A or Class B. Now, I know a lot of people have questions and are confused about, time cuts. If you do certain program, if you get your GED or you go to college or whatever. So you can get additional time cuts for different programs, and a lot of that has changed recently in how they do that. The maximum that you could get cut off is an additional 2 years. So it's not like he could, get his GED and then get an associate's degree and then get a bachelor degree and then get another one and another one and another one and just keep going to school and just keep knocking it off. The max he could cut off is 2 years. So let's see, that would put him getting out. Best case scenario for him would be 2046 or 2047. But it's very uncommon for people to get the full 2 years off. And, that's assuming he gets all of his good time credit. If he loses it because he's broken rules, then that will push his date back. So, yeah, that can fluctuate. I mean, over the next 26 years, we're going to see that out date increase, decrease all over the place.
We've talked, obviously, these crimes involve children, some as young as toddlers. You're a mother. Does the fact that you have a young child at home, does that bring any sort of special emotional resonance to this case?
It does. I didn't expect it. But the way that I viewed this case, the way that I saw it before my daughter was born and after my daughter was born is like night and day. And I don't know why I didn't expect that. Now in hindsight, I think, gosh, you moron. Of course it's going to affect you differently. Yeah, but it does change things. I told you before I've had this thought about this is the case. This is the case that I talk about. This is how I explain these things. Because how do you explain to your kid that, how do you tell them the world is not always a nice place? Not everyone has your best interests at heart. Sometimes you'll be talking to someone who you think is your friend and they are very much not your friend. How do I tell her that? How do I tell her that in a way that she understands? How do I tell her that I'm not being overprotective? I just know what this looks like. And this case is how you do that. Gosh, I think about her all of the time and working on this case. I think about my daughter. She's one. So, this is way far down the line. But right now, we don't have to worry about her because she's safe. She's with us. Or she's with, my parents. Or she's with family. She's with people that we trust. We know she is okay all of the time. And at some point, I won't be able to protect her from these things. I can only teach her. So the sentencing hearing was on a Thursday. I took Friday off. That whole day, I kept looking at her and I kept thinking, because she's 1, and I kept thinking, you're going to be 27 years old when he gets out of prison. And I kept having this thought of, I can't protect you from everyone, but I just protected you from Kegan Kline. Kegan Kline can't hurt you. You want to talk about an emotional day. If those are the, I just kept having, it completely changes the way that I viewed this work. I think it's probably part of why the aftermath has been a little harder on me than I was expecting. I fully expected Friday to wake up and just feel like I was on cloud 9, that I was just like my ego is going to be huge. I'm going to be feeling light as a feather. I woke up, I felt like I was hungover. Like I had that nauseous hangover feeling. I felt like I'd been hit by a truck just from the adrenaline dump. And then sitting there, I just wanted to be with my family. I just wanted to hang out with my baby. It was a totally different experience being a mom.
Well, that's really profound and well said. I know. Yeah. I mean, I joke to Kevin when we have kids, I'm like, no internet.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine what you went through with this.
We've literally, after this has been over, we've joked, we're like, she's never going to leave the house. Like we're going to turn into the most strict parents. We've got to reel ourselves in because this is.
But there's so much of this out there that I think people are only beginning to recognize the level, and that the predators are not all of the predators are in a van on your street anymore. They're in your child's phone.
Right.
Terrifying.
And pretending to be a friend.
Yes.
It's not like someone who's a 40-year-old guy saying, "Oh, I'm 40 years old. My name is John." I'm a 40-year-old guy, but I'm pretending to be 14-year-old Emily Ann, or.
And there's something so sickening about essentially weaponizing kids' naivete or curiosity,
right.
Or, maybe they're starting to get crushes on other kids and weaponizing that and making them almost like participate in the abuse themselves by having them be sending the photos, because it's just adding a level of guilt to everything.
Right.
Oh, God.
And then, some of the trauma, and for Kline's victims, some of the trauma they have now is that they look back on that time and think, gosh, like, I did those things. I participated in that. And now as an adult, I'm looking back and and realizing now as an adult that I was manipulated here and I was taken advantage of. But for how many years did you just have guilt and embarrassment about it until you're old enough, mature enough to see it for what it is?
Yes. Taking advantage of a child and a child
right.
of trust. I'm curious, this is a case that certainly has attracted a lot of media attention. And are there any myths, misconceptions, or just other things about Kegan or this case that you would like to discuss, dispel, or sort of, fact check?
There's that could be its own 3-hour episode. Yeah. I don't know that guys, I don't know if we have enough time to go through everything. I think, at this point, I think the biggest thing to keep in mind is that if Kegan Kline says anything, you have to take it with a grain of salt. So the perfect example of this would just be the simple facts of this case. He is communicating with hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands of girls that we can see on his devices. 2017, they get the search warrant, they get his devices, they're interviewing him, and he cops to it. And he says, yeah, that's me. And he says, no, it wasn't my dad. My dad doesn't know tech. Like, I would never, in essence, and, I'm paraphrasing a whole lot of stuff here, but like, if my dad knew that, he would be furious. He'd never talk to me again. Like, that would be unacceptable. yeah, I mean, he's, which is something that makes sense, right? Like you're not going to like go through your child porn collection and be like, hey dad, look at this. That's not something that is there's no camaraderie in that. This is something that happens very much in an isolated manner. We moved to 2020 and the 2020 interview after his arrest warrant was issued, right? And it's some of the same things where then he's saying, well, it wasn't me. And he's like, well, it was me. Okay, it was me. And so you've got to, you catch him in these lies and point him out and say, look, man, we know you're lying. And then he'll fess up to it. Then you move to Barbara McDonald's interview with him. And I mean, she's not law enforcement. She just cold called him with a video visit and he showed up for it. And he's admitting it to her as well. And, you know, in that interview, he says, well, I did it because I was lonely. Anthony's my middle name. So that's where Anthony Schatz came from. And then he says something in that interview where, you know, at one point he's like, yeah, I think my dad knew. And then he's like, no, he definitely didn't know. Like he kind of goes back and forth on that, even in that interview with her. And then we move forward and he's going to plead guilty. He's going to plead guilty to everything and he's going to get sentenced. And that's where we are. And then we go, finally, we're getting closer. We get to the sentencing. And in, you know, his interview for the PSI, and then this comes out in the sentencing where he's blaming his dad for everything. And I think, and you guys interviewed him, right? And he did the same thing with you. He said, no, that was my dad. I only did what, like 7 or something of the 25. And of course, the 7 that he's copping to are the ones that are just, and, you know, I say this with air quotes, that are just the topless selfies. You know, I didn't have any of that stuff with the little kids. And so, you know, I mean, he now he's putting it on his dad. I heard apparently he's putting it on a friend now with Rick Snay. He's said, well, no, it's not my dad, it's a friend, or he's alluding to that. He alluded to you that it was his dad. I don't know if you aired that portion of it, but I've seen the whole video. He was for sure there was no alluding to it in the sentencing hearing. He was clear that his dad was involved. With you, he's, you know, sort of him hawing around that. Then with Rick, he's saying it's this friend. When I tell you that these conversations were happening for hours at a time, for days at a time, there's no way that this was anyone else, right? Like that would require, if someone else was doing this, if someone else was pretending to be Anthony Schatz, that would require them having his phone for hours at a time for days on end, because that's the gravity of these conversations that we're talking about. This isn't, you know, a few pictures. This isn't a couple of conversations. This is what he was doing all day, every day for years. And that is coming from like cold, hard data. There's no, I mean, we're not splitting hairs here. It is what it is.
You mean there's no way he got hacked for that long?
No, there's no way he got hacked. And like, what, I mean, he was in his early 20s, right? Like what early 20s kid is giving his phone to anyone for more than like 2 minutes? I mean, I'm in my 30s. I'm not letting my phone out of my sight. You know, like, it's so unreasonable.
You mean he didn't black out on drugs and people would come in his house and steal his phone and do bad things?
I mean, he may have blacked out on drugs. I can't say that. But like, this is going on. This is a consistent pattern. And I think the other thing that's important here is it's not just that it was happening for hours and hours and hours, but it's the exact same verbiage that he was using with these girls is what he was using in the jail chirps and phone calls. The exact same tone, the same sex acts and descriptions, the same phrases. I mean, this is clearly the same person. So, you know, he just, poor Kegan, feels sorry for me, right? Like, feels sorry for me. I've had all of these things happen. But, like, you're not the one to feel sorry for. Plain and simple.
One thing that when we reviewed the 2020 August transcripts between Detective Vito, Deputy Marshal Clinton, and Kegan, one thing that they seem to be at least like alluding to the possibility of is that verbiage existed in some of the counts that maybe could have pointed to two people using it in the Peru house. And is that something that was eventually sort of ruled out, or is that something I'm just curious about that.
Yeah. So I can only speak about my own perception of this. I don't know, as far as other people, what they believed. But I do know, of course, what you're referring to. So I think those points are the parts of the conversation when he would, as Emily Ann, say things like, would you have a threesome with me and my dad? And I think, there's this tendency in us to be like, that's weird. That's weird. Like, why would he be saying this? Like, I think there's this thought of like, well, maybe someone else who is of that age would be involved. And so this is how they're getting that. But ultimately, I mean, Kegan was saying a lot of weird stuff. I think that was just one of the things. So for me, there's also the reality that like law enforcement can lie to you in interrogations. And sometimes that's a strategy, right? If we go in and I'm interviewing you and I'm saying, I'm trying to get you to admit to something you've done, one of the things I can do is be like, I know what's going on. Like, I would have done the same thing. This is, you're trying to align yourself and sometimes just take that burden off of the person because they're more likely to admit. And so I don't know, maybe that was some of it. Maybe it was an interrogation technique. Maybe they thought, oh, there's a possibility there's more than one person using it, because it's such a weird thing to be asking these kids, like, would you hook up with me and my dad? I think that's Kegan. Yeah, again, I mean, I've read a lot of his conversations. I've read a lot of his chirps. I don't think it's unrealistic to think that that's just one of the tools in his toolbox. He also, I mean, he had crafted the Adam character using the photos that he'd gotten online. It's the exact same MO as the Anthony Schatz stuff. So I don't know. I tend to think that it was him.
Yeah, the Adam stuff, the various personalities. It's just such a tangled web of, I don't know,
stuff.
Yeah, it's like its own universe or something that he created for himself. One thing I wanted to zoom out with just the macro of all of this, and it's, I guess the status of CSAM investigations in Indiana. We were really impressed with Chris Cecil and the work you did, the work Dave Vito did on this case. But I suppose, at this point, do you feel like the laws, the penalties, and the resources given to law enforcement for these kinds of investigations are where they need to be, or is some public advocacy needed to bolster any of that?
I think a little bit of both. It's such a lawyery answer to be like, well, it depends. Here's some answers. But I think that's just the most, I think that's the best answer that we have. I think what we did in this case was some pretty incredible work. And I'm hopeful that, we get through the Court of Appeals, the appellate process, and we'll be fine, because I think that there is a good legal basis for everything that happened, and it's very well supported in the record. I feel good about it. But what that brings us good case law that we can use moving forward and say, look, like, this is allowed and here's why. I think, on one hand, we could have stricter penalties for these kinds of cases. On the other hand, looking at the resources for law enforcement. I mean, Chris Cecil testified that there are 2,500 investigations annually in Indiana that ICAC alone handles. That's a lot of investigations, and it's a small team in the big picture. We talk about this case. I know there's a lot of frustration about why he wasn't arrested in 2017, and I share that. Like, Dave Vito had testified that he believed there was probable cause to make an arrest in 2017. I would agree with that. It didn't happen. We still have a job to do. We still have to get this done. And in 2020, we all, suited up and got the job done. The one benefit. And I a case like this, I have to look at the silver lining, because if I hyper focus on, the problems, it's going to make me go crazy. And I still need to get this done. I can't dwell on that and like make my work worse by hyper focusing on those problems. You got to address it. You got to deal with it. But we got to look at our strengths. And so the timing of this could not have worked out any better. The fact that we got this in 2020 is the reason that we got this sentence. And it's because of the resources. Now let's think about the timing. Chris Cecil got this in April of 2020, which is in the thick of the COVID pandemic shutdown, really. From a law enforcement perspective, we were being encouraged to slow down investigations. Don't be doing your drug interdiction pullover. Like, try to slow down, because we want to minimize the spread of this pandemic. The courts are shut down. Like, we're doing initial hearings, but we're doing things over Zoom. We're continuing things out. Everything, I mean, we all remember what that was like, about how everything was just put on pause. What that did for this case is unbelievable, because Chris Cecil testified that he could work on this case for like 3 months. That doesn't happen. I mean, you get this case, you go through it, you do the dump, you get it done. Maybe you work on it for a week. I don't know. I mean, maybe they work on it a little longer than that. But he spent 3 months going through this, and he could do that because with the pandemic, they didn't have the cases coming in that they normally do. He also testified that, which is pretty common sense, that technology changes over time. So between 2017 and 2020, the technology was better. He could get a better examination done of those devices. Because of the timing, because everything was slow, then we all were able to put in more work out of the gate. The amount of work that went into this case in 2020 is not normal. It's awesome for our perspective. We got excellent work, but that is not the norm. We can't spend 3 months on every single case just from an investigative standpoint, right? Like, I have like 1,000 pending cases in my court at any given time, because I have everything from a seatbelt ticket to murder that has been filed in my court, This happened when it needed to for us to be able to do this. And so, I think it's in part a resource issue, but that's not just with CSAM cases. I think that's just generally speaking, so many of the issues that we have, if we were able to put the resources toward them, we'd be able to see some change. A case like this, the reason we were able to get this done so effectively was because we had a whole team of people who, at the right time, could devote an unbelievable amount of time on just this case.
The Miami County Prosecutor's Office didn't.
Say that again. You're crying.
You guys did a great job on this case, and I think we, on the episode of the day of the sentencing hearing, talked about how impressed we were with you personally that day. And other reporters we talked to on breaks talked about what a great job you did, and some of them were saying to us, "Oh, she has a big future" and stuff. So I'm just curious, what does the future hold for you?
Thank you very much. It's very high praise. I don't know. Right now, I'm just kind of basking in where I am. I think so often, we look too far ahead in the future, and then that can overwhelm you, or that can like change the way that you do things. And right now, I think we're just trying to do the best job we can with what we have. I've been having these conversations with Jennifer a lot, because we've been working on this case for quite some time now together, and putting these pieces together, and just how do we do the best work that we can for our community? And, you have these conversations as an office, but I she and I have just happened to have these conversations a lot lately about the things that we can do, the ways that we can be better, the ways that we can change things and kind of push things, the ways that we can, fight the fights that are important to us and not get bogged down in it. And we know, 2023 is the year of the trial for us. And we knew that we're still in the backlog of COVID. We're hoping this year is kind of the end of finally getting caught up from that, which is kind of crazy to think about. But we are really busy this year. And I think, it's a political job being the prosecutor. It is an elected position. The office is run by the elected official. And so, of course, there's always a lot of, you could lose your job overnight from an election. I'm hopeful that Miami County keeps us all around. Because I got to tell you, I'm there. So, of course, I want to keep my job. But we also are so lucky to have such a good team, and such a good team that really is working well together. And that's, we're doing things. We're really trying to be creative in the way that we come up with some of these arguments and the way that we tell these stories and the way that we fight for our community. I think it's really important. And I think a lot of people from the outside looking in would think, well, that's just a tiny county in Podunk, Indiana. Like, these are probably some second-rate attorneys. Who do you have in there? And we're so lucky that we have some talent here. And we work really well together. And, it's important to us that we have good relationships with our law enforcement. The Miami County Sheriff's Department, they were on top of every single hearing. And I would talk to them all the time, and they'd be like, whatever you need, we got you. And so it's that kind of camaraderie. I can't thank the people that I work with enough. This is, that's a lot of high praise that I appreciate, but it's not a one-man show. We don't get here without working together and making sure that we are all working for this one common goal. And so, I think it's nice. It's nice to be in a community like that.
Is there anything we didn't ask you about that you wanted to add or think it's important for the listeners to understand?
So I love that you asked that question, because I basically ask that at the end of every search warrant or every trial, every witness. And I warn them all of the time, because the first few times I asked that question, I feel like they would look at me and panic, be like, what do you mean? What do you mean? What did I? And I'm like, no, I'm asking you in case I forgot something. It's fine. So I do appreciate that. And then I don't know if you want to have this here or maybe back when we're talking about the sentencing hearing, but some of you and I had talked about some of the strategy.
Yeah.
So one of the things as far as strategizing how to put this argument together, there's different ways of doing this. And ultimately you're telling a story, and this is how it is in a jury trial, right? Like, you're trying to convince these 12 jurors, these 6 jurors, that this is what happened. And here we're trying to do the same in front of the judge. One of the things that's important is that you're delivering this in a way that makes sense. It's got to be coherent, consistent. But sometimes it has to be passionate. And so, I think there's a lot of things that we were doing and talking about that were very intentional. You pointed out, Kevin, in the sentencing hearing episode, that, like, to start the argument, that I went right in and, like, really, really went for it. And talking about the search terms.
Yes.
I respect that you quoted them verbatim, because I know how hard it is to quote those verbatim in a public sphere. So I respect that. And one of the things that you mentioned was kind of that it woke you up. It kind of shocks the conscience. And that's exactly what it was supposed to do. And, we knew that he was going to give his allocution statement. And so you're trying to anticipate, okay, what is he going to do? And so, we know he's going to wax poetic about how he's sorry about how he's done these things. Here's all of the things going on with me. And you should give me a lighter sentence because I've changed and I'm a better man and I'm going to be a better man. And then, from a strategic standpoint, okay, he's just said all of that and he's very emotional. Don't get sucked into that. I'm going to drag you back into the forefront. This is who we're talking about. We're not talking about the grown man who has learned his ways. This is who we're talking about. This is the person whose search terms are these terrible things. And then let's get into it. And we're just going to go through and take all of that away. So much of the strategy is anticipating what they're going to do and take the wind out of their sails. And some of those things, Eric Honeyacre, he did a nice job of trying to pull some of that information and put it in a way that was lighter on Kegan. He wasn't given a good hand to work with as a defense attorney, and I've heard Kegan's not very happy with the work that his attorneys did, but I mean, he didn't give them much to work with. Like, the facts are what they are. What was he going to do? Objection. She's killing our case here. Like, there's nothing they can't, they did everything they could. I work with these attorneys often, Andrew Rocky, Eric Honeyacre, Bill Berkshire. They are very talented attorneys. And so, Kegan Kline is never going to be happy. And that's all there is to it. But I have a great deal of respect for the attorneys who represented him. I work with them often. We've, I think, a good professional relationship. And they did what they could. He really didn't give him much to work with.
Yeah, gosh. He put them through a lot, I think.
Yeah, I think you're probably right.
But was there anything else or any other memories that stand out through this whole process for you that you sort of reflect on now that it's over?
I think to look at it from a big picture is really the way to look at it now. And, I would regret if I didn't take the opportunity to thank all of the agencies that have worked on this case, to thank Chris Cecil for the work he put in, to thank Dave Vito to thank Dave Vito for all of the work he did. I mean, the number of times that I would call him and just be like, hey, I need this thing. Can you find it? And he would drop everything and get whatever I needed. He came to our office and we would have 3-hour prep meetings and just go through these things. Okay, let's see you in 2 weeks and we'll go through these things. I owe them a great deal of thanks and gratitude because they put so much work into this. And the people in our office who, made sure we got there. We are incredibly blessed. So more than anything, I just want to thank all of the people that helped us get here.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, that's all of our questions. Thank you so much, Courtney. This has been amazing.
This has been incredible. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It.
Thanks.
We want to again thank Courtney for being so generous with her time.
We also want to note that as we followed this case, we were quite impressed with the work we saw being done by Courtney, Jen Kiefer, and the Miami County Prosecutor's Office, led by Jeff Sinkovics.
Thanks so much for listening to The Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for the murder sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening.